asked me to do was to think about and describe whereabouts in the lead do you make the call, and also to talk a bit about variations. We'll come on to that in the second part of the talk. And because of the variations, I'm going to focus mainly on or entirely on doubles ringing, but the methods for working out where you make the call really apply on any numbers of bells. So effectively, two parts of the presentation, but there's a while to go on yet. Right. So, plain bob doubles. That's a lead and a half of plain bob doubles. Not terribly informative, just laid out in a block of numbers like that. So we'll put. Say again, Thomas. I've shared it.
Zoom just been very slow today because it was messing up for me. But yeah, at the moment it's
So what,
you
shared.
I thought I had.
Mum couldn't. I can see it on Mum's. And then click that.
No, what am I clicking?
No, that one. No,
This one.
yeah. Maybe I have. Share.
There we are.
And click PowerPoint.
Far too complicated.
Click to go from.
That's it.
Right.
Yes,
Here we are now.
Thanks, Thomas.
Right, now, start from the beginning again. Conducting doubles. Going to look at where we make the call and a brief introduction to ringing variations in doubles. So we start off with plain bob doubles, which is not terribly helpful when you've got just a whole bank of numbers like that. So we'll break it down into component parts. So I've outlined in red the treble, as you can see it plain hunts up to the back, down to the front, up to the back again, because we're only showing a lead and a half of plain bob doubles in this at the moment. Next, we'll have a look and see what happens to one of the inside bells, and we'll choose the 3. It hunts up to the back, down to the front, makes seconds, and then starts to hunt out to the back again. And you can see on the left-hand side, we've now introduced the place notation. You'll remember that Janet talked about place notation a few weeks back, and it just shows which bells stay in the same place during the in the changes. When you get back to where the treble leads, the 3rd, as we've just seen, makes seconds. Bell at the back makes fifths, and in fact, you can see the blow before and the blow after. So those of you that know plain bob doubles will remember that's long fifths. And then in the middle, you've got the 2 and the 5 cross. And in fact, I've extended that out a couple of blows so that you can see that those are the 3/4 down dodge and the 3/4 up dodge. So that's plain bob, and you can see all the component parts. What we really need is only the bit above the treble. So we're now going to look and compare a plain lead with a bob lead. And you can see the place notation, the difference is 125 when the treble leads in the plain lead, and 145 when the treble leads in the bob lead. And if you recall Simon's talk from a couple of weeks back, he was explaining that if you ring a plain course of plain bob doubles, you have 4 leads. Each lead is 10 rows long, and so you have 40 rows, but there are 120 rows of plain bob of doubles that you can ring. So you need to generate the other 80. And the way of doing that is by swapping some of the bells around. And the way, the simplest way of doing that is to change the seconds place made at the lead end to make it a 4ths place. And then having done that, we now need to decide where to call the change. And what we do is just simply compare the rows one by one until we see a row that's different. We're only worrying about what's above the treble, to the right-hand side of the treble. And as you can see, these rows are all the same, still the same. And now we've got a row that's different, because you can see that the 3 hasn't made seconds. It's hunted out to 3rds place. The seconds hunted run into 2nds place. David at the weekend, when he was talking about changes and what is a change, stated the fact that in ringing, you give a whole pool's warning of something that's going to happen. So when you start a method off, you'll say, go plain bob doubles, and it will, at the hand stroke, treble's hand stroke lead, and it will start to the next hand stroke. So you get a whole pause. At the end, you will give a whole pull warning, and it's the same for a bob. So you can see on the right-hand side, we've listed out whether it's hand stroke or a backstroke row. The first row that's different is the backstroke row, the treble's backstroke lead. So we need to call the bob one whole pull earlier, which is when the treble's in seconds place on its way down from the back. Now you can see there's actually a bell that we've missed off the row at the moment in front of the treble. That bell can be any one of potentially of the 4 bells that are working, the 2, the 3, the 4, or the 5. In this instance, it's the 3. But the important bell really is the treble, because that will always, by definition, be in seconds place. Because the next thing that's going to happen is the treble is going to lead, and that's where the bob takes effect. So from a calling point of view, the simplest thing to do is to watch the treble. As the treble starts to put its backstroke at this point, you say bob in a nice, clean, firm voice, with or without exclamation mark at the end, and the bells will have their whole pull warning in order to swap around. Because the next question is it always the same place? Now, as we'll have a look at reverse Canterbury. So on the left, we've got plain bob doubles, plain lead, and on the right, I've got reverse Canterbury. You may remember Phil's done a couple of talks about learning methods, and reverse Canterbury is one of these methods where you really don't need to learn a completely new method. Reverse Canterbury is plain bob doubles with a slight tweak when the treble, just around about the lead end, and the tweak happens above the treble. So we'll just have a quick run through. So seconds is still made just as it is in plain bob. Long fifths is made just as it is in plain bob. The difference is in the other 2 bells, where instead of doing the do-si-do or the dodge, they make thirds and fourths if it's the 5 coming up from the front, or if it's the 2 coming down from the back, it does fourths and thirds. And you'll see from the list on the right-hand side where it says hand stroke or backstroke, that those places are made backstroke and hand stroke, which is slightly disconcerting when you're used to making seconds hand stroke or backstroke, or lying behind. It's a bit like lying behind. So the 2 does backstroke and hand stroke in fifths, backstroke and hand stroke in fourths, backstroke and hand stroke in thirds. Other than that, you just ring. The rest of it is just plain hunting. So there's a plain lead and there's a bob lead, and we've done exactly the same in reverse Canterbury as we did in plain bob. The plain lead is 1-2-5 and the bob lead is 1-4-5. So you can see the effect of this is by making the 2 make fourths. It's made fourths, the change before. It makes fourths at the bob, and it makes another set of fourths immediately after the bob. And so it does 4 blows in fourths. It's a little bit disconcerting for the poor old ringer of the 5th, who's just unaffected at this point. He's doing 4 blows in fifths, but it's following the same bell for 4 blows, which, if you've not done that before, can be a bit strange. And then just for this point, we'll just add in the bells underneath the treble and have a look and see what happens with the. So first of all, we'll look at the 5, and you can see the 5 comes up and it makes its first set of thirds, and it would normally go up to make a set of fourths if it was a plain lead. But at this instance, it has to come back onto the front and do a lead again and then disappear out to the back. And the 3rd does a similar thing. Instead of making seconds, it runs out, can't get past the 2, so it has to make thirds and go back onto the front again. We'll have a compare of the 2 methods and see where we call the bob. So starting from the treble being at the 2nd blow at the back, comes down, still no change, still no change, still no change. Aha. And as before, we've got a difference. It's the treble's backstroke lead, so we go back and call a bob. And you can see in this instance, reverse Canterbury and plain bob doubles, the bob's called at the same point when the treble's in seconds place. So now we'll move on a bit further and look at something a wee bit different. We're going to look at Grandsire. And we're going to look at a plain lead of Grandsire on the left and a single lead, just to be different rather than a bob lead, on the right. If you look at the plain lead on the left, for those of you who not know an awful lot about Grandsire, you can see the place notation is remarkably simple. You're either lying or leading, apart from the very first change after the treble is led, when thirds is made. And that really goes back to the sort of hearts of why it's called doubles. There are two pairs of bells that swap in every row. True doubles ringing. Over on the other side, there's the set of thirds that's made that I was referring to. Then over on the other side, seconds is made when a single's called. Looks remarkably like what we're used to with the reverse Canterbury or with the plain bob doubles. The manoeuvre in thirds is that long thirds is made. So bell coming off the front does 4 blows in thirds and goes back onto the front again. And then the 2 bells in 4/5, because you can see when the treble's leading, we've made 3 lots of places at the moment. They just do a long double dodge. So that's what happens at a Grandsire single. So now we go through the usual process, the one you'll all recognise. We'll compare the two sets of rows as the treble comes down from the back. So you've got 1, 2, 1, 3, 2. Aha. And it's now different because we've now called a single. And you can see this was slightly sooner than before. And the effect of that is the single in this instance is called when the treble is in thirds place at hand stroke, as outlined by the H on the right hand side. So Grandsire, you make the call a blow earlier than you would in plain bob and reverse Canterbury. Generally, for most methods, you're going to find the calls will be made in when the treble is in seconds place. Grandsire is a definite exception to that. And as we see, there may be some others to come up with as well. So now we move on to variations. For those of you that remember back in the day when we used to go bell ringing and we used to consult diaries and we used to read the ringing world with great enthusiasm, and at the end of last year, beginning of this year, the ringing world and various enthusiastic people have come up with the concept of pathways. And on the blue pathway, step 2 was ringing variations. And we adopted that certainly at Harborne and Smethwick, and we'd rung a few variations. And so I'll just go through how variations are determined. So with a variation, you have a base method. In this instance, and my examples at the moment, I'm going to use plain bob. And the first variation we're going to have a look at is Kenning call, which is now on your right. And I'll give you a moment or two, you look at that and you'll see there's absolutely no difference whatsoever between those two columns of numbers. 1.5 leads of plain bob, 1.5 leads of Kenning call. The point with a variation is that the change only occurs when you make the call. And when you make the call, you effectively use a call from another method. And it's not just the change at the lead end where the treble is leading, but it's all of the alteration in that call, which sounds a bit odd. But what it effectively does is you remove some of the bells out of the right-hand side. So when the call's made, all those bells above the treble go into a different set of work. And for Kenning call, that set of work is the reverse Canterbury bob, which we saw a few minutes ago. So with a reverse Canterbury bob, the bells above the treble look thus. So you've got bell making long fifths, bell making long fourths, one bell making thirds followed by another bell making thirds, and those two bells cross in 1, 2. And you can see in this instance that in plain bob doubles, a bell will make long fifths. And in the reverse Canterbury bob, a bell makes long fifths. So you're still able to have an observation bell. The bell making long fifths can be regarded as the observation bell. By the observation bell, I mean they are not affected, effectively not affected even, by the call. They are doing the work that they would have done anyway. The only difference will be is they follow the same bell for 4 blows. So what happens now is you have plain bob on the left, missing those that part that is affected by the bob, reverse Canterbury bob on the right, and it, when you put the call in like that, miraculously it becomes kenning call, and the bells are all rotated around. And of course the question then is, at what point do we make the call? So we go back to where we were a few minutes ago. There's the plain bob on the left, kenning call on the right, and you can see that the numbers at the bottom are different. And we go into our comparison, again looking at where the treble comes down from the back. The same, the same, the same, the same, different. Now remember, this is a reverse Canterbury bob that we've got here, and when we rang a reverse Canterbury bob in reverse Canterbury, the call was made when the treble was in seconds place. But here you can see we actually need to make the call when the treble is in thirds place. So you can't just transfer what you knew for reverse Canterbury bobs in reverse Canterbury into ringing a variation. The reason for that is, if you see here, in plain bob, the fifth goes from thirds place to fourths place when the treble's in thirds place, but when you call a bob, the fifth starts the bob work, and it immediately makes thirds at that point, and so that pushes the need to call the bell, make the call one place earlier than you would have done if it was just reverse Canterbury bob in reverse Canterbury the method. So we now look at a method called April Day. Again, plain bob on the left and April Day on the right, which is just plain bob, but we remove the section that's going to be affected by the call. The call for April Day is a Grandsire single. Now this now raises another interesting point. Traditionally, when you're ringing variations, the calls are always made as a bob. So regardless of what the call actually is, whether it's a single or an extreme or a bob, you always say bob, and you just say bob. You don't say Grandsire single or reverse Canterbury bob. What you're learning, when you learn a variation, the idea is you learn the variation's name, and to go with that, you need to know what the base method is. Is it reverse Canterbury? Is it plain bob? Is it something else? Is it St Simon's, St Martin's? And then you have to learn what the call is. Is it a plain bob call, a plain bob bob, or a plain bob plain lead, or whatever? So this is a Grandsire single. It's what we've seen earlier. Seconds is made, 4 blows in thirds is made, and the bells at the back do a double dodge. But it would still be called in the variation. You would say bob to insert it. And if you look at this again, thinking where base method is plain bob doubles. Seconds, when the treble leads in plain bob doubles, seconds is made, and seconds is made in this method. So that would make your observation bell the bell making seconds. There we go, and that's April Day. Plain bob doubles with a Grandsire single when the bob is called. Next question: at what point do we make the call? Again, we'll go back and compare line by line. It's all the same so far. Now it's changed, and as you will realise, the bob is called when the treble is in thirds place, which in fact is exactly the same as when you call a bob in Grandsire doubles. You call the bob when the treble's at hand stroke in thirds place. So in this instance, unlike the previous example, having a Grandsire single in plain bob doubles doesn't affect where you would call the single in the same way, because in Grandsire doubles you would call make the call when the treble was in thirds place. One last example in this, we will have a look at May Day. Again, May Day has plain bob as the base method, and it has a new call that we haven't seen before, called a Pinks single. Pink single has an alternative name as well. It used to be called a Woollerton single, but it be now known, I think, to all and sundry as a pink single, named after a gentleman, a ringer in who at the time in Oxfordshire, called Alan Pink, who I think now is down on the south coast. And he had a band that was ringing lots of doubles and doubles variations of doubles, and they named this call after him. And again, I've just started to mark up. You can see that seconds is made when the treble's leading, so that would be your observation bell. 4 blows in thirds, so at the moment it's looking remarkably like a Grandsire single. The difference is at the back, where instead of lots of dodges, the bell here coming up from the towards the back will be double dodging 4/5 up in a Grandsire single, does 3 blows in thirds, in fourths, and 4 blows in fifths, and second does the reverse. So again, you're now finding the second, poor second does 3 blows over the same bell, which is a little bit strange. We put those two together to make Mayday, and then we need to know where we make the call. So we look at this and we track down from there, the treble comes down from the back. And lo and behold, our first difference is here, which is earlier than we've seen on the other examples. When we move on, you can see that the treble is now in fourths place, coming down from the back when you make the call. We have run this once or twice at Smethwick and at Harborne, and I have to say, making a call, calling a bob when the treble is in fourths place, is very strange. You're sitting there thinking, well, I'll never remember that until the lead end, but of course it all starts straight away. The other thing to remember with variations, I've been talking about observation bells, and those are the bells that are unaffected at the call. So you can see if you follow the path of the third here, it just makes seconds and carries on in its own sweet way. You have to be careful not to make the call at the last lead, at the end of the last lead of the playing course. The reason for that is, as you can see, we take out a whole chunk of all the work really above the treble is potentially changed. And that means that rounds, if you left it until the last lead of the course to make the call, when you get to the end of the cycle, the bells won't have shuffled back to rounds, because some of the call takes effect after the treble has led. So how would you put these together in some quarter peals? Well, some of these. So if you're ringing reverse Canterbury as your bass method, and you use a plain bob, you're ringing south reps, and you could say to your band, well, we'll just ring reverse Canterbury all the way through. The first extent we'll use a plain bob. The second extent we'll use a Grandsire single. We'll be ringing Clifford's Pleasure. And the third extent we'll use a pink single, and we're ringing Royston. So if you've got a band who's going to be very enthusiastic and learn lots of bits of information, then you would just say, go south reps. And at the end of that extent, every time you said bob, they would ring a plain bob, having been ringing while ringing reverse Canterbury. And at the end of that extent, you would then say Clifford's Pleasure, and they would realise to carry on ringing reverse Canterbury. But when you said bob on this occasion, you're ringing a Grandsire single. And at the end of that extent, you would then say Royston, and they would automatically know that you carry on ringing reverse Canterbury. And every time the conductor says bob, you ring a pink single. One way of doing it. The other alternative, which is the way we've rung a couple of our quarter peals at Harborne, is you keep the calls fixed. So in this instance, we have a pink single is going to be the call. The bass method to start with is plain bob, and that variation is called Mayday. And then you can ring with a pink single reverse Canterbury, as we've just seen, that gives you Royston. And then you can ring a pink single with a method called St. Simon's, and that gives you St. Ignatius. One of the nice things about variations, you've got some wonderful names. The advantage here is that you can say to your band, right, for the first 5 extents, we're going to ring, every call will be a pink single. And for the next 5 extents, every call is going to be a Grandsire single. And then you can just say the name of the bass method, so they don't have to remember anything about the variation names. It does mean they don't find out what they've rung until you publish it in the in Bellboard or in the ringing world. But hey, you've still managed to ring the quarter peal. So things to think about when you're ringing about variations. Think about where the call is made. So it can be first place, fourth place in the examples we've seen. It could well be in other positions. You just need to go and work your way through to see where the first alteration is, and to the base method, and then go back one whole pull. Make the call before the last lead. You can make the call at the last lead, but it does require an awful lot more planning and forethought. It is by far simpler to make the call in the first, second, or third lead ends, and I would counsel that in the first instance. Think about which bell is the observation bell. So you just need to reflect on your calls and decide whether you're going to make the call when you're making seconds or when you're making long fifths, which will generally be the observation positions. And then last thing I just wanted to mention here is symmetry, because we've got a few minutes to think about that. And what do I mean by symmetry? The three calls we've looked at when we've been talking about the variations: Grandsire single, reverse Canterbury, and bob, and a pink single. And if we draw a line through like that, that's the line of symmetry. And what I mean by that is, above that line is what happens above that line is reflected below the line. So if we look at the 4 in the Grandsire single, it makes 2 blows in thirds, and it happens, it's the same bell in this instance, it makes 2 blows in thirds afterwards. That's the same, it's symmetrical. We look what happens to the 2, does 2 blows in fifths, 1 blow in fourths, 1 blow in fifths. And you can see that's reflected on the other side. It just happens to be the 3 that's doing it, but 1 blow in fifths, 1 blow in fourths, 2 blows in fifths. It's symmetrical. It's a mirror image. In the reverse Canterbury bob, you can see long thirds in inverted commas is made again. It just happens that the first 2 blows in thirds are by the 5, and the second 2 blows are by the 3. Single, again, you've got 3 blows in fourths, followed by another bell making 3 blows in fourths. It's all symmetrical. It's not always the case. The old Hudibras single is not symmetrical. So because it's not symmetrical, I'll only put a dotted line in, because what we're going to do now is we'll just have a quick look and see what happens to one of the bells. We'll choose the 4. And the 4 does 2 blows in fifths, 1 in fourths, 1 in thirds. And if it was symmetrical, the bell on the other side would be the same, but it's not. You can see the first bell is the 3rd, but after that it changes to the 5. Old Hudibras single is not symmetrical. What happens on before the treble starts its lead is not reflected in what happens after the treble starts its lead. Still got a bell making seconds. You've still got an observation bell. If you use an old Hudibras single with the base method of plain bob doubles, then you get the variation called old Hudibras doubles. Surprise, surprise. I will leave it as an exercise for yourselves with a piece of paper and pencil to work out where you make the call, but you might be quite surprised at the answer. It's a fairly straightforward process. You've seen how it's been done. So, in summary, bobs can be called almost anywhere. Well, certainly we've seen them being called when the treble is in seconds place, thirds place, or fourths place on the way down from the back. Now, just bear in mind, if you discover they should be called somewhere else, that you just need, the way to do it is you have to give a whole pause notice of things changing. Would just say variations are great fun to ring when we can ring, and I'm sure they'll still be great fun when we get back to it. You really don't need very much experience to be able to ring variations. If you can ring plain bob double, if you can ring touches of plain bob doubles and Grandsire doubles, you can have great fun ringing variations. Just bear in mind the bear traps in variations. So the calls can change in the place in which you make the call. So if you think back to the reverse Canterbury bob, if you're ringing reverse Canterbury, you make the call when the treble's in seconds place. But if you're making call using reverse Canterbury bob and in, for example, plain bob doubles, then you make the call when the treble's in third place. If you're using a reverse Canterbury bob with other doubles methods, you may find the call is reverted back to second place. It's not always consistent. Just remember not to make the call at the end of the course. Make it at the first lead end, the second lead end, or the third lead end. And just bear in mind that within doubles, not all of the calls are going to be symmetrical. So you just have to do a bit more work with paper and pencil. And just a broad comment about doubles. Doubles are a law unto themselves. And what I mean by that is really in virtually all ringing or common ringing that was done on a week by week, day by day, Sunday service by Sunday service, methods and the things we ring are symmetrical. But as we've seen with Old Hudibras and with other bits and pieces, they don't have to be symmetrical. Another difference between doubles and the rest of the world is you can ring doubles on 5 bells. You don't have to have a cover. Whereas generally speaking, the Central Council would expect you to ring a peal of triples with 7 bells ringing the method, principle, and a tenor following behind, and likewise on caters and sinks and so on and so forth. Particularly now, Basingstoke are not a 9 any longer, but there are lots of 5 bell towers, so ringing doubles without a tenor is perfectly acceptable. And then after that, just a few acknowledgements. Simon for his presentation on why we need a bob. Janet for her presentation earlier on a few weeks back on place notation. Phil about learning methods and realizing that you don't need to learn everything from scratch. David last Saturday for explaining changes and generating again why we need bobs and how bobs are generated. And last but not least, Thomas for generating the 120 odd slides in this presentation. He wouldn't put his name on the list, and he refused to allow me to say anything, but tough. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm just having a quick look at the chat box has been fairly quiet actually throughout the presentation. Again, just remind people that you can unmute yourselves. I hope. So if you do have any questions for Steve, either raise your hand, type in the chat box, or unmute yourself. Now's a good time. Oh, message coming through. Oh yeah, well done, Thomas from Claire. I just wanted, just in the last couple of minutes, whilst there aren't any questions, first of all, to echo really what Steve was saying around, if you've got a band who, can ring these things, things like bob doubles and grandsire doubles really well, then actually, varying it up with these variations that Steve has really clearly described can be a really fun way of expanding your, your repertoire, and actually, you've got the building blocks all there. So it's just a case of adopting what you know already and just putting it in. And then David, it's just been in the chat box, that line about doubles being a law unto themselves. I would agree with that. And finally, to Steve and Thomas, I thought the graphics were excellent in that presentation, really, really clear. And I think people will find it very, very useful to go back over this video and the PowerPoint that will be on the Guild website. I think people find that really, really useful to recap those. So just encourage you to do that. If there aren't any questions coming in, I will stop the recording and then unmute you all. And as usual, it can. So I'll stop the recording now.